Welcome, bienvenue. Mon nom c'est Charlene McCoy. Je suis la directrice
My name is
générale.
Charlene McCoy. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Cities of New Brunswick.
The Cities of New Brunswick Association's Executive Director. My name is Charlene McCoy. I'd like to say thank you for all of you for joining us today and exploring the current and future role of New Brunswick's 8 cities. Merci à vous tous de vous joindre à nous pour explorer le rôle actuel et futur des 8 villes du Nouveau-Brunswick. We have an incredible diversity of teams and speakers for the next 4 weeks. Just to give you a little example of some of those leaders, we have Carol Saib from this, which is the CEO of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We have also Dr. Prudhomme, which is le recteur de l'Université de Moncton.
Who's the president of the University of Moncton.
Executive Director of the Multicultural Association of the Greater Moncton Area, and Dr. Paul Majral, which is the president of UNB. And just naming a few, we have many more, especially those that we have here today. Nous avons des représentants de partout au Nouveau-Brunswick.
We have representatives from across New Brunswick in this webinar. Approximately 300 people registered for this webinar.
We have an estimated 300 participants that have registered. Je tiens également à souligner le soutien et le leadership.
I also want to draw attention to the support and leadership of the 8 mayors of cities in New Brunswick who helped to put this webinar series together.
Of all the 8 city mayors in making the speaker series a reality. So thank you and merci. To start the session today, it's my privilege to now turn things over to Mayor O'Brien from the City of Fredericton, and he will introduce this week's theme and speakers. Alors, Mayor O'Brien, c'est à vous.
Thank you, Charlene. Welcome, bienvenue, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I will be serving as your moderator today. On behalf of the cities of Bathurst, Campbellton, Dieppe, Edmundston, Fredericton, Miramichi, Moncton, and St. John, welcome to this inaugural session of Strong Cities, Strong Province Speaker Series. We're grateful for the technology that allows us to connect virtually during these challenging times and extend our best wishes and thoughts to all the individuals, families, and seniors that are dealing with the impacts of COVID-19, as well as our healthcare workers. Thank you all. We're extremely pleased with the widespread interest in this speaker series, including participation from all 3 levels of government and the private sector, community leaders from all parts of New Brunswick and beyond. The Strong City, Strong Province Speaker Series will address the important question of how New Brunswick's 8 cities can contribute to a viable and sustainable future for the province at a time when we're facing a challenging pandemic recovery process amplified by legacy economic, social, and demographic challenges. We all know what those are. The speaker series is designed to examine the future role of New Brunswick's cities and the critical importance as economic innovation and population growth links and hubs. I wanted to remind you that the speaker series is being delivered with simultaneous translation services, which you can access through your Zoom screen. We will be delivering content in both languages as the series progresses. So with that bit of background and context, it's now my pleasure to introduce the first of our 4 speakers, David Campbell. David is the president of Jupia Consultants, Inc., a business and economic development consulting firm here in New Brunswick. David has more than 25 years experience as a consultant working with industry, not-for-profit organizations, and governments across Canada. His focus includes economic development strategy, economic impact analysis, population growth, cluster development, and investment attraction. From 2015 to 17, David was the chief economist with the government of New Brunswick. In that role, he led the development of economic policy and economic development strategy for the provincial government. David is a columnist with Brunswick News, a published author, and writes weekly for the It's the Economy Stupid blog, as well as presenting the weekly podcast Growing Pains by David Campbell. In recent years, he has had the opportunity to collaborate with multiple think tanks and policy research organizations, including the Conference Board of Canada, Public Policy Forum, Donald J. Savoy Institute at the Université de Moncton, and the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University in Toronto. So after that introduction, David, the floor, I guess, is yours.
Well, good morning, folks, and thank you, Your Worship, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. I've got a few slides I want to walk you through. So hopefully you're able to see my presentation. So basically, I'm going to make the argument here this morning as part of our series that we need to really grow our population in the province. I'm going to argue we need to get to roughly 1 million residents by 2040. And I'm going to show to you that it's not maybe as hard as you think, and that a lot of this growth, or the bulk of this growth, will have to happen in our urban centers and in our cities. And then I'll talk a little bit about the role of our cities to make this happen through 2040. So, in fact, this is the average annual growth rate in the population we would need to see to get to 1 million population in New Brunswick by 2040. So that's only 20 years out. We would only need to grow at about 1.3% per year. Now you say, well, that's a fairly significant population growth rate, and that is true. But in fact, we've done that before in the early 70s and after the Second World War. We saw growth rates very similar to what we would need between now and 2040. And if you look at other provinces right now, like Saskatchewan, Prince Edward Island, and Manitoba, they are all growing right now at the same average annual growth rate that we would need to see. So all we need to do is to get up to the level of Prince Edward Island in terms of annual population growth to hit that target of 1 million by 2040. Why do we need 1 million population? Well, I think we've all been talking about it. We now have one of the oldest populations among the 60 Canadian provinces and US states. 1/4 of our workforce is slated to retire in the next 10 years. Economic growth has dropped to only about 0.5% per year. And as I said, other jurisdictions are already getting it done. So I think we owe it to future generations to work on a very aggressive population growth strategy moving forward. It's not going to be that difficult, as I said. We're going to need to get up to around 13,000 immigrants a year by 2025. All other things being equal. So yeah, again, it's a big jump between the 6,000 we saw in 2019 to the 13,000. But once we get there, if we can sustain it, we can hit our target, I believe, of 1 million by 2040. So the reality is when I first pitched this idea of 1 million population, everybody was skeptical, or many people were skeptical. But in fact, since 2016, the population here is actually growing. It's increased across the province by 23,000. Most of that has been in the cities, or an average annual growth rate of 0.6%. So we just need to get that number from 0.6 up to 1.2 or 1.3 moving forward. So what's the role of our 8 cities to achieve this population growth? Well, obviously, if we're to get to this 1 million population, we're going to have to see the bulk of that growth in the province's 8 cities and the urban areas that surround those cities. Smaller towns and rural areas also have opportunities for growth based on natural resources, tourism, and other industries. But really, the cities have the greatest capacity for growth, and the industries that have the greatest growth potential tend to be more concentrated in urban areas. So there were just under 300,000 living in our 8 cities in 2020. And my view is we're going to have to see somewhere around a 45 to 50% increase in the population of these cities by 2040. So that's a very ambitious goal. But again, Moncton is already on the path to hit that goal, and Fredericton as well. So I think we just need to see the other cities step up population growth, and Fredericton and Moncton keep on the path, and we will get to that 45 to 50% growth by 2040 across our 8 cities. If you look historically, and I've done a whole presentation on this, I'll just summarize it. Basically, across the country, the urban population in 2016 was actually higher than it was way back in the 70s and 60s. So there's more people living in rural Canada now than there was back in the 70s. The difference is there's been massive growth in the urban population. So 18 more million people living in urban Canada than rural Canada in 2016. If you look at those numbers for New Brunswick specifically, you'll see here that we've seen basically urban and rural growth ticking along about the same. So what we really need is not to shrink our rural areas, but we need to grow our cities and our urban centers. So what are the 5 roles I'd like to see for our cities through 2040? And we'll unpack more of that with the other speakers and as we go through this session. But we do need to strengthen our role, the role of our cities as talent incubators. This is incredibly important. We don't have as large of a natural supply of population growth, so we're going to have to bring in international students. We're going to have to bring more people to the province, and the post-secondary education system will be key. We need housing development strategies all around the province. I think most of you are dealing with that now, but if we're going to grow the population, we will need more housing. We need to strengthen, not weaken, our air transportation system. I'm very concerned that COVID-19 is going to lead to less air service in the province moving forward. We need to make it a strategic priority to address the air transportation system around the province. And we need to invest in our city's research and development infrastructure. New Brunswick lags the rest of the country in R&D, and R&D is going to be fundamentally important. We need to be more productive. We are still an export-focused economy, and driving more research and innovation will be key to our future in our cities and across our province. And we need our cities to increase their role as incubators of ambitious entrepreneurs. This will be critical to ensure our economy comes out of the next 20 years even stronger than ever. And they need to be amazing places to live. People have more choices around the world to live than they've ever had in the past. And we need to have our cities right at the top in terms of quality of life. So finally, I'll just end by saying we're at the fork in the road right now. One road, the road of population growth and urban growth, leads to sustained prosperity and good quality of public services and quality of life. The other leads to a shrinking population, declining industries and tax revenues, and constant squabbles about how we divide up a smaller and smaller pie. I think we need to get on the high road here, and we must increase our investment and focus on New Brunswick cities. And with that, I'll turn it back to the mayor.
Thank you, David. And a lot of good points there. One that I heard repeatedly was the role that universities can play in this, in attracting immigration and newcomers, in the research and development that we need to drive this province forward. So a lot of other good points on that, but that one really resonated with me as well. Next, we have Herb Emery. And Herb is the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at UNB. An advisor to federal and provincial policymakers, Dr. Herb Emery focuses his research on the development of the Canadian economy and the persistence of long-standing regional disparities. Aside from understanding the economic fundamentals of growth in a small open economy, Dr. Emery's work incorporates political, historical, cultural, and other institutional factors that have shaped Canadian development processes. Along with his postdoctoral fellow, Sarah McCrae, he is working on a book that covers government approaches to developing the New Brunswick economy over the past century. So, Dr. Emery, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor O'Brien. I always get struck by the length of the introduction sometimes. I think I'm getting to a point I'd just rather here's Herb. We'll get going. I want to follow up on David's great presentation to move away from thinking about cities as the object and thinking about the mechanics of why strong cities might contribute to a strong province. And the reason we need to think about this is in the 1990s, we were involved in a very different type of municipal policy discussion, which was really about cities as a replacement for provinces. So at the time, if you remember with the Martin and Chrétien era, the big city mayors were lobbying for a direct line to Ottawa. They wanted to be an official third level of government, no longer creatures of the province. And in the extreme case, the city of Toronto had actually hit the point where they had legislation written to make them effectively the 11th province of Canada. And so when you start to think about this contention and where a lot of rural insecurity comes from, the idea that we don't need provinces anymore, we need strong cities, we need strong mayors has increasingly been a dynamic in Canada. And as we come out of COVID, we're going to see that our problem is if we're not seen as having strong cities, we won't necessarily be a target for some of that federal intervention to keep the national interest growing, because the national interest is served by those three largest cities that, as David's pointed out, are absorbing more and more of the population. So I want to go back and think about what it is about cities that's so important, and how does that inform us about what we need to think about in New Brunswick, and why we need to think about 8 cities and not just one big one. We don't want Moncton to become Halifax. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And this gets down into the dynamics of growth in a small open economy. And we are an export dependent economy, as David noted. And what that means is we don't have a zero-sum game between communities. What it means is that if we can create wealth by getting a market share globally, we can grow, we can get bigger, and it's not at someone else's expense. If you close the economy off or you have a shrinking domestic market that you're relying on, now you have a zero-sum game, and now you're pitting community 1 against community 2. But the win that comes out of this is if we can get coordination on making ourselves competitive as exporters, we need to think about what role the cities play in making sure that that translates into a higher standard of living in the province, not in Toronto, which is what's happening now. We don't have competitive business sectors in New Brunswick. We are the only place in Canada, or I guess the Maritimes in general, which has not seen a growing business service sector employment like the rest of Canada. And that tells us that our cities are not creating the conditions to retain enough of that wealth that's going out through the exporters. And so what we want to think about is having competitive cities, not with each other, but competing with the best service providers around the globe and in Toronto. And if we believe the COVID dynamic, we can get our services from anywhere now that things are digital. And so we need different thinking about what would a high performing city look like as retaining that wealth that we're creating from our hinterlands. So I just want to go through an evolution of thinking about cities as creating growth for a provincial economy or a national economy. The older model of a growth pole goes back to a 19th century that if you could have an industrializing city, so factories with people who aren't producing their own food, who aren't making their own clothes and things like that, they would create demand for the local hinterland to feed the urban population. So in that model, if you did something like a tariff, like after Confederation, you create all these factories that come into the urban centers, that creates demand for the local produce from farmers. Everyone feels happier and richer. But we don't have that today. We don't feed ourselves from our hinterland. We only get about 7% of our food from local production. Other than that, we're importing and we're paying for it from our specialized exports in the forest sector, in aquacultures and fisheries, from mining, and a whole host of traditional industries. So we need to think about this growth pole idea that if you grow the cities, it will grow the hinterland isn't necessarily the case, because the hinterland doesn't supply what the cities need. So we have to reverse that thinking. This isn't cities driving the province. This is going to be cities are going to enhance the province. A newer thinking is you can replace the hinterland on traditional industries with increasing reliance on new sectors that have agglomeration effects, clusters, or external economies of scale or spillover benefits. There's a lot of euphemisms. The idea here is if you can just make a sector bigger, or you can make your city bigger, you start to get growth just from the dynamic of getting larger and getting more cost competitiveness just from the scale effects that come from having more local producers. And this goes back to the 1970s when they weren't going after IT, but they were going after electronics manufacturing in the province. Or if you remember Multiplex in St. John, that was supposed to bring 15,000 jobs to the city of St. John alone, if that had worked. And it was going to be a cluster of metal fabrication. The notable outcome of it was Bricklin came. That was part of the multiplex agenda. So this has been tried before. And again, the challenge with it is you're bringing in footloose companies, especially in IT, and you have to really be on your game if you're going to get that cluster. And if you want 8 cities to do it, as I've mentioned before in previous presentations, you need a high level of municipal government cooperation, maybe through the province, so that you can mimic being large with a larger network of cities. You're not going to become New York City, you're not going to become Toronto. And so how do you get the advantages of being large when you're not really ever going to be large? And the risk if you fail is that Halifax is going to get huge, because that will be the regional center if you believe this model. So where does that leave us? We have to go back and think about, why do we have 8 cities in the first place? Why don't we just have one, like a Moncton or a St. John? And the reason is because wealth was being concentrated from hinterland exports. Bathurst in the 1960s was the province's fastest growing city around mining development, around pulp and paper and everything else. As we've seen those engines decline, we've seen cities looking for replacement industries, trying to find a reason to keep people there. But what we see instead is migration down to the greater Moncton area. And so what you have to think about is that what cities really do is, by providing services and providing things that are needed to sustain the population of the region, they actually concentrate the wealth that's coming from the export sector. And to do that, you have to have environment that businesses are competitive with other places that can supply. So you don't want your exporters importing what they need in terms of tax accounting or legal services, which is what's happening in the province right now. Is a lot of our exporters, they just use providers in Toronto. They're not paying for the people to be here. So we lose those professional services and the larger opportunities there. So if we don't really think about this holistically, that we need to think about making sure that we have the social license to get our exports to market so that we can create the wealth. And then in the meantime, the cities are working hard to make sure that someone has a value proposition of setting their business up in your community so that they can be as profitable as somewhere else. Then we'll start to see the concentration of that wealth creation coming in. My final point is, if you fail to do this, you're turning Moncton, an area, into a and probably seeing as a dynamic we have left in a smaller number of places.
Mayor O'Brien, I think he's having some internet problems.
Yes, Herb, you kind of, yeah, if you can hear me, Herb, you froze there the last minute or so. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to come back on, and if not, then we'll move on to the next one. Okay, looks like you froze at the very end there, Herb, and that's too bad because we were looking for your wrap up, but we'll get it in your presentation that'll be online. So apologize for that. But there was some real key points there. Primarily, I heard around the fact that the 8 cities have to cooperate together to attract the federal investment, and also that we have to be there to compete on the world stage. One place can't do it by themselves, and there was a lot of factors that you brought up, so I really appreciate that. The next speaker is Don Mills, and Don is currently the president of Crane Cove Holdings Limited, his family investment firm, a partner in Cabco, an IT infrastructure company, and Total Marketing and Communications, a Bermuda-based company he co-founded. He's the founder and former owner and CEO of Corporate Research Associates, now called Narrative Research. His commentaries are regularly published in all daily newspapers and many weeklies across Atlantic Canada. Don has been active as a business leader and community activist, serving on more than 24 boards over his career. He is recognized as a public opinion expert by various judicial bodies and is a certified research insights professional. He was recognized as a fellow in the market research industry in 2008 by the National Association, the only Atlantic Canadian to be so recognized. He was chosen as Business Person of the Year in 2001 and as a runner-up in 2007 by the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. He was inducted into the Top 100 CEOs Hall of Fame in its inaugural year in 2005 by the Atlantic Business Magazine. Don continues to be passionate about Atlantic Canada and an advocate for change in this region. Don, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. Bonjour à tous. I'm very pleased to be on such a distinguished panel. I've followed the other members for many years and appreciate the work that they've done on a very important topic. As somebody who's really followed the social, political, and economic trends in Atlantic Canada for a long time, let's just say, I was always struck and couldn't really understand why our region trailed the rest of the country in economic development for decades. And I was always trying to figure out what it was that allowed us to lead the country in unemployment and to have really slower than normal economic growth. So just to put it in perspective, in the last 12 years in New Brunswick, the real GDP growth has been a very anemic 0.6%. Well, Canada at the same time is 1.7%. Doesn't seem like a lot, but when you compound that over a period of 12 years, it's like 15% difference. In other words, if New Brunswick only grew at the same rate as the rest of the country, it would be the economy would be 15% bigger than it is today. So I'm trying to figure out why would that be? Are we less motivated, less entrepreneurial, not as skilled? What is it that causes Atlantic Canada to be lag behind the rest of the country? And it took me a while to kind of, figure it out. And as somebody who has studied population trends and demographics for a long time, I think I came up with the answer. The answer is pretty simple. We have a major structural problem in Atlantic Canada. And if we don't address that structural problem, we're going to be in the same position going forward. So let me just start with population information. I think you can see the slide, I hope that's up there, that looks at population growth of the country between 51 and 2016. What do you see in that number, in that graph? Well, first of all, you see a country under complete growth, in a constant manner. This is 1% growth over 60 years. Almost all the growth has happened in urban. That was the big kind of first aha moment I had about 15 years ago. And if you look at the distribution of the population in Canada, 81% in the 2016 were urban, and the rest were in rural populations. So what does that mean? It means to me that if you're going to grow the population in the province, you have to concentrate on urban communities at the initial stage of things. If we look at the next slide, if it can be turned over. The next slide, okay. Keep going, next slide, please. So this is New Brunswick over the same time frame. And what you see here is that around the 1990s, growth stagnated in New Brunswick from a population point of view. Why? Well, baby boomers stopped having kids. That's it. And, we've not had our share of immigrants in this region forever. So in New Brunswick, as the last census, 5% of the population were born in another country. In Canada, that number is 22%. So a big difference. Not having our share has really been a problem. Now look at the percentages of people living in urban versus rural. 53% living in urban, 47%, almost the same number, living in rural. More than twice as many as the rest of the country. What does this mean? What it means in some simple terms is this: too many people are living in the wrong place without an economy to provide full-time employment, too much reliance on seasonal work. That's it. And look at the growth lines between the rural and urban. There's no discernible pattern here. This is what's got to change. We've got to get the 8 cities growing at a more normal rate. And just a couple other quick facts. 11 of 15 counties lost population in the last census. 11 of 15. 5 of 8 cities lost population in the last census. Now, I think some of that is improving based on recent data, but we've got a long way to go. So, I've been promoting for about 10 years this idea of a economic hub strategy for all of Atlantic Canada. And let me just take you through New Brunswick for a second. If you take a look at the next slide, I believe we'll start to look at a hub. So this is Fredericton. Mayor O'Brien, you live in an area within 75K. There, at least as the last census, 147,000 people live within that hub. And by the way, people are treating Fredericton like a hub today. It's actually happening. People are coming into the city from the outlying areas for services and for work, for entertainment, for culture. It's already happening. So that's not the problem. The problem is that we haven't thought about these areas, these zones, as economic hubs. We haven't had strategies against these zones to take advantage of what of the assets within each of these zones. So the next one, please. There's St. John, 75K. And this region lost 5% since the previous census. Still has 168,000 people. The next one is Moncton, I believe. 217,000 within 75K, and it had gained a small number of people since the last census. The next one, please. Miramichi, almost 90,000 people, but a decrease in population since the last census. Next one. Bathurst, 112,000 people within 75K. The next one. Campbellton, smaller, 33,000. And so, if you look at the next one, Edmundston also had the most population loss, I believe, still 46,000 people, not an inconsequential number of people. So I did some research, and why did I pick 75K? Well, here's the reason. It's based on data that says that people are prepared, the vast majority of people living within each of these circles are prepared to commute at least 65, 70K for jobs and for services like healthcare without moving. This is the whole thing. People say, oh, this is, this is to the advantage of these 8 urban areas. No, it's not. It's actually to the advantage of people living in nearby rural communities to be able to stay in those communities, but have nearby full-time job opportunities, because the nearby urban areas are growing. And the only way they can grow, is by growing their population. And the only way they can grow their population is by concentrating on immigration. So each of these, I have seven hub areas. You can slice it any way you want, but to make them successful, you have to do at least a couple of things. One, you have to have a regional economic strategy for the whole economic zone. This is what Halifax has done. Halifax, I want to remind you, serves a population of almost 500,000, within a 65-mile radius. They already have a regional economic agency to deal with this geography, the Halifax Partnership. They have a major focus on immigration and population growth. Those are at least the 3 things that each of these areas need to do, and some of them are already in place. For an example, St. John just recently put together all their economic development agencies to serve this marketplace. Moncton has done this with 3+. So that's the future, I think. And let me just finish by saying this. In my view, if we cannot grow each of these urban areas, take advantage of what each of they have to offer, there can be no prosperity for New Brunswick without population growth. It's as simple as that. And I think by focusing on these 7 hubs, and by the way, these 7 hubs will serve over 90% of the population within a reasonable commuting distance. That's the key, getting people thinking that by serving their needs in a nearby urban area, they can stay and live wherever they want to live in the province. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you,
Don. Appreciate the data, and the message that come out of that for me is that regional hubs, but absolutely we need a regional economic strategy to drive that, and also that it also means it implies investment in the core, so people can come into the core and use the services, but live where they wish to. But the key investment from the province would be in the core areas. So lots to think about there. Next, we have our final speaker. Richard Sayon is a Moncton-based economist, public policy consultant, and a PhD candidate in political science at Dalhousie University. He is also a columnist for BNI newspapers and l'Acadie Nouvelle. Richard is a former vice president of the Université de Moncton and former director of the Donald J. Savoy Institute, a public policy research organization. He's also spent nearly 15 years in Ottawa in various departments, including the Privy Council Office, Industry Canada, and Transport Canada. Richard is the author of 4 books, including Over the Cliff, Acting Now to Avoid New Brunswick's Bankruptcy, which was written in 2014, and Shale Gas in New Brunswick, Towards a Better Understanding, 2014, co-edited with our previous speaker, David Campbell. His most recent book, A Tale of Two Countries, How the Great Demographic Imbalance is Pulling Canada Apart, which is being published by Nimbus in 2016, was a finalist for the National Business Book Award. Mr. Sayon, we're waiting to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I'm going to be speaking in French for a few minutes and then switch to English. So for those of you who need the services of an interpreter, I believe that there's a button at the bottom that you can press. C'est très intéressant, les 3 présentateurs jusqu'à date.
It was really interesting to hear the 3 other presenters. They have very different perspectives on this. I had prepared some notes, but I'd like to make some introductory remarks before moving on to my notes and my presentation per se. First of all, I'd like to invite people to really think about the difference between the symptoms of a situation and the deep-rooted causes of it. So I'm going to give you my conclusion to start off. New Brunswick is an extractive peripheral area and has been for over 100 years, and its urban-rural structure really reflects its geographic economy, this deep-rooted relationship that were created throughout history that means that New Brunswick today is a peripheral a peripheral area, a hinterland area like Gaspé, that is just a group of different isolated regions. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to try and explain to you how I see demographics. And according to, in my opinion, it's the driver of economic growth, and it's not necessarily a good thing. I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm going to talk about northern New Brunswick here to start. No, this is the Moncton slide, but let's find the northern regions. And I'm going to talk to you about the trends in the four northern census agglomerations, the CAs. So within the 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, the four northern CAs have lost 13% of their population of people of the core working age. They lost 8% of their private sector jobs, but in the public sector, they had a 12 to 13% growth. So those are the trends in the northern areas. So if we think of the urban areas as economic drivers, well, we see that really wasn't the case in the northern CAs. It was just in the public sector, health especially, that there was growth, and that's not what's going to create a number of jobs. It's the population really that creates economic growth. Now in the St. John area, the CMA,
three urban centers in southern New Brunswick are similar in the sense of in terms of their population trends. But in fact, St. John, which is a more industrial city, shows pretty much the same trends as the four northern cities. If you look at the population of 15 to 64 over the last decade, it's down. Private sector employment is down and public sector employment is up sharply. So again, the driver of growth in the St. John area for the little growth that they've had was in the public sector. Now, the next slide, I'm going to turn to Moncton, and but it is probably similar in Fredericton. It's just that I felt that I would use one city to show what is happening. And if you look at a place like Moncton, in blue, it's the only place where you have some blue. You do have some growth in the population 15 to 64. You do have robust growth in public employment. But when you're looking at the private sector, and I've used here trade, retail and wholesale trade, transportation, food and accommodation, as an example of what I will call services catering to local consumers. So the role of Moncton as a regional service hub, what you're seeing there is that there's strong growth in that sector. But in terms of Moncton as a place where you create wealth as part of the industrial base in terms of exports, if you want, in manufacturing and business services, which I believe include also call centers, the trend is downwards considerably. So I'm going to stop the presentation now and move back to stop sharing my screen and try to talk about what's going on here. Well, what's going on here is that with aging, you get two phenomena occurring. First of all, there are fewer people available for work. And secondly, you have more needs in the public sector in terms of health and elderly care services. So what's happened over the past decade or so is that labor has shifted from the private sector to the public sector. Private employment in New Brunswick is down by 15,000 over the last decade. But in the public sector, it's up considerably, even just in healthcare and elderly care, it's up about 8,000 jobs. Even in Moncton, if you consider, and what's going on, okay, I'm gonna talk about, so jobs are migrating from the private to the public sector. And within the private sector, what you're seeing is that jobs are migrating for what were historically export-oriented jobs towards locally oriented services jobs. Now, what is going on here? What's going on essentially is that we have the only source of growth in jobs was the public service. Public service dollars means more dollars spent locally, so therefore more retail trade, more transportation, more housing. But also you have a torrent of retirement dollars flowing into the economy with private pension, old age security, CPP and all of that. So that is a further impetus for migrating labor from export-oriented industries to local services industries. So the winners in this context like that are places that cater well to local services, such as Fredericton and Moncton. The losers are the entire province and St. John, because what's happening is we're seeing is deindustrialization of the province, and therefore much less resilience, economically speaking, than before. And that is strictly due to population aging. So therefore, my contention is that if we are to manage to even stabilize our industrial base, we're going to need much more immigration than we needed before. So I joined David on that count. But again, to me, immigration to New Brunswick is a reflection of a deeper cause, which is the retirement of the baby boomers. So once the baby boomers will have fully retired, that gap that we're seeing between the number of people who turn 65 and the number of people who reach working age will narrow again. And therefore, immigration to the region, unless we found other sources of economic growth, which is what David has been discussing recently, and I think all of us join each other on that, unless we find other sources of economic growth, our biggest challenge post-2030 will not be to grow the population. It will be to stave off decline, because older baby boomers will start dying in large numbers, unfortunately. And the jobs that are being vacated by baby boomers will no longer be available. Therefore, immigration should slow unless someone has a different model in mind and can manage to turn New Brunswick in something else than it has been for the past century. So my contention is that we should continue to focus on natural resources. We should continue to focus on making sure that we have the best business climate possible. But for the next 10 years, our priority should be on immigration, which is why I've said, if I had an advice for cities about what should be their priorities for the next $1 billion in economic development, I'd say $999,999 on investing in the social infrastructure to welcome more immigrants, and the last dollar on a lottery ticket. Because we are pulling against gravity in this province. We've been pulling against gravity for 100 years. And we've had generations of very successful businessmen. I'm thinking the Irvings, the McCains, now we have Polk Aquaculture. We had generations of very powerful premiers in Louis Robichaud, Frank McKenna, and we are still in the same position than we were 50 years ago, or even 70 or 100 years before. So I would like to leave you essentially with the following thought, is that when we consider how we move forward, we need to have not only a deep respect for the powerful forces that are shaping our economic geography, but even more importantly, a deep understanding of those forces and how they will shape our opportunities moving forward. I wish we could all have a Silicon Valley in our backyard, but that's not what nature blessed us with.
Thank you very much, Richard. There's a theme in there about immigration we've heard throughout all the different presentations, and the research that's needed. And again, that can tie back to universities as well, but there's research that has to be done to be able to drive these policies that we're all, being articulated here today. So thanks for that, everybody. Now I'm just looking at my watch, and we promised everybody an hour, so it's 11:45. And we started a couple of minutes late, but we'll try not to go any later than 12 to 5 minutes after 12 to respect everybody's time. We have some questions here that I wanted to. The thought was we'd throw a question out and have the four panelists debate them or add to them, but I don't think we'll have time to get that deep in it at all. But we will commit to it if there's questions again from the public that we can follow up and make sure people get on it. So I'll start with a question. I'll throw it to one of the panelists, and maybe the way we'll have to do, just because of time, is that one panelist speak to that issue, and I'll put another question to another panelist. So if you don't mind, that's what we'll do. So we talked about common themes. So each of you shared a unique perspective with respect to the role of New Brunswick cities in helping to create a strong New Brunswick. And after listening to all the presentations, do you think there's a theme or themes that connect all four visions? I articulated kind of what I heard, but I'd love to hear from you. And we'll start in reverse order, and I'll ask Richard to speak to that.
Well, I'll start very fast by saying that there's a common agreement that there's a need to, I won't call it shake off the status quo, but find innovative ways to create new wealth locally here so that more money from primary industries flows to our urban centers, but also that we have innovative ways of linking together to create some sort of critical mass in order to move forward. in generating more self-sustaining growth and more self-reliance moving forward. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure other panelists may have other views and maybe wish to enrich the conversation.
Okay, well, that was quick enough. We can get another person to chime in on that one. So Dawn, what do you think about the common theme?
Well, I think we're all talking around the same challenge. The one thing that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention is that I used to think that the reason why our population wasn't growing is that we didn't have economic opportunity for people to come here. I've changed my mind on that. And the reason I changed my mind is if you look at what's going on in PEI right now, which is really a small market, they're outperforming the rest of the region consistently year in and year out. And the only reason that they are is that they're growing their population, which leads me to believe that, you know, population growth creates job growth. And in fact, if I've got my numbers right, PEI has more new jobs in the last number of years than any other province in Atlantic Canada. So the creation of jobs has come because the population has grown. And let me give you one example why that would be. Well, if you look at the housing market in Charlottetown as an example, where most of the growth is, their vacancy rate is less than 1%. And they're building as quickly as they can, which creates economic opportunity. Now, to Richard's point, it's serving the local market, but nonetheless, it's creating a lot of economic opportunity and jobs. And so I now subscribe to the theory that the more people that come in, the better it is for the economy, because those people will find ways, especially immigrants. Immigrants are really good at finding opportunity and working hard to live their dreams.
Good, thank you very much. We will move on to the second question, which is the NB urban strategy. So the government of New Brunswick is embarking on municipal reform, thus the reason for this speaking series, and is committed to the creation of an urban strategy. Could you share your thoughts with respect to what you believe should be included in an urban strategy for New Brunswick? And I'll go back to Dawn on this one, and then we'll have David follow up if he could. So Dawn, add your thoughts to that, to an urban strategy.
Well, you know, as I mentioned, I think we need to have a regional economic strategy for each of the economic zones within New Brunswick that serve the vast majority of people. And that strategy needs to be some consolidation of services as well. Hospitals, as an example. I mean, how many regional hospitals do you need to serve a population of less than 800,000? I would, and this is an unpopular view, I get it, but you know, I think you probably have too many hospitals, and you could probably, you know, right now all the specialty services are in the southern part of the province. You want to come for cancer treatment or heart or whatever, you have to come to, you know, one of the three southern cities. But if you could consolidate the delivery of healthcare, for instance, some of the other centers could have specialties within those centers and allow people to be you know, cared for within their region. So I think the whole thing that the New Brunswick government has to do is, first of all, find a way to reduce the number of municipal units. You have way too many for your population. You know, you've got to get that number down. That's a must, as far as I'm concerned.
Hey, thank you, David. Your thoughts on that?
I just want to reiterate what Don said about population growth. I think we don't really think about that enough. The reality is that if you look at employment and GDP, depending on the level of aggregation, if you're talking about a city or a province or a country, somewhere between 70 to 80% of GDP and employment is based on local market activity. It's retail, it's construction, it's local services. So you need that core 20 to 30 export-oriented activity. But if your population is not growing, it's very, very hard to see how you could grow an economy at a 2 or 2.5% rate in the future. So I think Don's completely right about that. In terms of an NB urban strategy, I would just take it from a little different direction than Don, and I would say it should be focused on, in addition to what we mean by having these urban hubs, which are hubs of activity for the entire province, I think we do have to think about what the sectors are and what the strengths are in each of the regions, and how we go about trying to foster economic development, and particularly entrepreneurship now, as I said in my remarks, now that 40% of our entrepreneurs are zooming toward retirement, no pun intended here today, I think we have to think about how our urban centers are fostering a new generation of ambitious entrepreneurs. And if we can get that done, I think we're going to have a better chance at growing the economy moving forward.
Okay, good. Thank you. We had a question from the audience. We haven't got time to get them all in, but there was a real profound one that I'd like to challenge you with. This wasn't part of our prepared statements or questions to you, but and David, because you were speaking, we'll go with you and we'll ask Herb to chip in at the end, the second part. One of the audience members said, I am an urban planner from Egypt and live here in St. John and can't find a job at all. So for the panel, and I'll start with you, David. Each of you has stressed the importance of population growth and attracting immigration. So how do we help our new immigrants settle and find viable employment opportunities?
So I think the first answer to that is we do need to primarily focus on attracting people that have the skills, interest, and aptitude to work the jobs that are on offer right now. That will create more demand for professional service jobs like planning and architecture and engineering and so on. But the reality is for some of those occupations, like the one the individual mentioned, those are very competitive right now. There seems to be a lot of supply, workforce supply for a sector like that. So it makes it harder. So I think we need to pursue things like, is there opportunity to turn that into a bit of an export service, to have companies that are actually providing those services outside the region? But for immigrants that are moving here into industries that already have a saturated workforce, it's problematic for them. And I understand the frustration. I've met with many, and we need to do what we can to work with them. So primarily we need to work on attracting folks that actually can find a job in the workforce today. And then that will sort of build impetus and hopefully create the demand for a broader set of jobs and professional occupations that many immigrants come and are looking to find employment in. But if we can't solve that first challenge, if we can't find the truckers and if we can't find the manufacturing workers and the IT workers and all of the sectors that we're struggling now to find workers for, it just makes it that much harder for other immigrants that are not in those sectors.
Thanks. And Herb, from your research and perspective, what would you say to that question?
So unfortunately, that's a question that reflects a lot of what I keep hearing over and over, which is incredible talent residing in the province currently, but no one's finding it in terms of offering the opportunity. So my challenge to the planners who are out there and anyone who wants to develop a strategy is to take Richard's idea of a lottery ticket. So you're going to spend a lot of money on your known commodities, good consultants who you know what they're going to come up with. Why not figure out a way to take an urban planner from Egypt who's worked in a massive country, massive population country, who has an eye for what newcomers are looking for, and give them a contract or an internship working with your group? It wouldn't be expensive. It might even be just a short-term contract, $15,000, $20,000, but give the opportunity, see what you get out of it. And if it doesn't work out in the old lottery tickets, you can try again. But one of the things we're not doing is taking sort of what I would call low bar entry opportunities for newcomers to show us what they can do. We're doing it at the university with postdocs, with research assistantships, and it's incredibly valuable, but we can only do so much. What we need to see is the agencies that have the funding, the governments that are asking for more immigrants, let's take a chance on these people and give them a shot at helping us out. They can tell us what attracts newcomers to a city, like what are the amenities you need, what is the housing you would do. One of the questions that follows up in the chat box from the urban planner from Egypt is he sees opportunities around the Port of St. John or in St. John. Ask him what those opportunities are. So one reason I think we're stuck is we keep asking the same people, what do you think you need to do? Let's ask the newcomers. And again, I can speak for the group I've worked with. There's incredible talent wandering our streets. We just need to ask them and figure out how to bring them in and integrate them. And we're going to start to unlock a lot of opportunity.
Can I just add one thing, Mike? Because I've studied this issue about welcoming immigrants to our region. I mean, we're very friendly in Atlantic Canada, but we're not necessarily that welcoming. And why is that the case? It's the case because we have no experience living with diversity. We have none. 5% of the people in the population in New Brunswick were born somewhere else. I mean, it's a very small number. Like if it was 1 in 5, like the rest of the country, or 1 in 2, like Toronto, it wouldn't be a problem. So we've got to get the private sector to lead on this score. They have to be prepared to create opportunities for immigrants. They have to, outside their comfort area, they have to promote diversity in their workplace forces. If we don't have that leadership from the private sector, universities are going to do it. Of course they are. That's the first place where it happens. But it's got to be the private sector that supports, making sure that immigrants have a fair shot at jobs.
Thanks, Don. Well, I had a couple of questions left. I'm just going to go with one. The one I'm not going to go on is the fact that we have so many different municipal units all across New Brunswick, and way too many. And I think that's the purpose of the municipal reform policy that's being driven by the province. So I think we all know we have an issue with that. So I was going to ask for your individual opinions, but we'll skip that one just for the minute of time. The last question I want to ask, and I'll throw this one to Herb to start, and then Richard can finish up on it, is fair taxation. Fair taxation is a common theme raised by municipalities, large and small. How do we ensure that all New Brunswickers are paying their fair share for key infrastructure and services, particularly within our urban economic regions?
Wow. So the real challenge is we can't really define what's fair. And I think even with the City of St. John report, Kitchen and Slack, there was a caveat in there that it is very difficult to determine what's a fair share of tax. So to me, this is a problem that comes up when you have a declining, shrinking water hole and you start to see rising burden on some groups and you're thinking about how to shift it. I'm just going to do a cop out and say, if you have a growing population, a growing city, and a growing tax base, you're talking about a fair share across a growing pie. And that's going to diffuse a lot of these tensions. And we wouldn't be as worried about things if there was growth. And so getting back to growth, I think, is the solution for getting away from, I would rather see Richard pay it or David pay it than me. If we have growth, we can keep paying the same rate. You get more money as a mayor. We all live happily ever after with playhouses, pools, and everything else.
Okay, leave the mayor's pay out of this, okay? Richard, your take on that.
Yeah, and just before we do that, just quickly, I'd invite people to read a column from a very fine columnist here that's called Herb Emery on the immigration outcomes in PEI and how he compares it to another region in New Brunswick, and that will provide you with perspective on population-driven growth. With regards to the municipal funding question, fundamentally, my concern is even bigger than that. We're about to go through a big local governance municipal reform exercise, or we're going through that exercise right now in New Brunswick. We'll recall that this exercise was inspired by a need to revisit what's called, we could consider, a pact from the 1960s, which was inspired by the Byrne Commission, which essentially reflected the times. At the time, we were talking about equal opportunity for all in New Brunswick, and that reflected the fact that we had just nationally adopted a program called equalization. And the idea behind that was that everyone should be getting similar services at similar levels of taxation. If you look at municipalities in New Brunswick these days and look at indicators of stress in terms of increase in the fiscal the tax rates and losses in fiscal and tax bases, or slower increases in tax bases, you're going to see that the indicators of stress are in the City of St. John, not the CMA, and the northern cities. So the question to me becomes, have we lost sight of equal opportunity for all? And how will demographics over the next decade, knowing that the North, it will be challenging to grow the population at the same pace as in the southern centers. So as we revisit this local governance reform as a question, we should ask ourselves what are our fundamental values and basic principles that should guide us in our reflections.
Okay, that's quite it's a challenging thought to leave us on. I want to thank everybody, and we will endeavor somehow to any questions that the audience participants or audience had asked, we'll find a way to try to get answers back to you as expeditiously as possible. So gentlemen, thank you very much, audience. And I'll just wrap it up here that I want to thank everybody. Amazing job. A lot of things to chew on here. Each of our guest economists has also written a commentary piece with respect to the role of New Brunswick cities as economic innovation and growth hubs. The commentary pieces are now available on the Cities of New Brunswick website in both English and French. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge how pleased the Cities of New Brunswick Association was to see the provincial government officially launch its local government reform process in January. Thank you for that. With the modernizing process, while the modernization process will be challenging, municipal reform is critically important in shaping a sustainable future for all of New Brunswick. Our 8 cities are encouraged by the province's commitment to meaningful stakeholder engagement and the need to recognize urban centers, large and small. And our success going forward lies in shaping a municipal governance model that facilitates regional cooperation and provides citizens with effective local representation in the efficient delivery of municipal services. The Cities of New Brunswick Association will continue to advocate for municipal governance and property taxation reforms that will give all 8 cities the ability to participate in decision-making that directly affects their costs, growth opportunities, and residential tax rates, and will ensure that we have strong cities in New Brunswick, helping to ensure a strong province for all New Brunswickers. Session 2 next week. Thank you. The slide is up, I think. Yes, it is. So thanks for participating in today's session on behalf of all 8 cities. And please plan to join us next week as we explore the critical importance of leveraging increasing linguistic and cultural diversity as a driver for regional population and economic growth. So merci, thank you all, and see you next week at session 2. Bye now. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.